Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Vincent Di Fate.
Thank you. Thank you all, folks. I was told about this panel just 4 or 5 days ago. So it came as something of a shock. This is not really a panel. This is actually supposed to be a recreation of a speech made in 1939 at an event which I was not present at, and in fact was born quite a number of years later. So, was anyone at the 39 Worldcon? Is there anyone here who was at the 39 Worldcon? Did you happen to see Frank R. Paul's speech? Did you happen to listen to it? I only have a title to go by, and none of the people who were queried who had attended that convention had any vivid recall of the speech itself. Consequently, I was told to pretty much make something up out of whole cloth, so I'm going to kind of second-guess Frank R. Paul, and hopefully this will evolve into something that will be enlightening and spiritually uplifting. And we'll kill an hour together, and you folks will know me a whole lot better, and I'll know you, and you'll wish you never knew me, and who knows. And there is a downside to this. I don't work well from notes. Notes were imperative for this presentation, and I have notes, but I don't work well from notes. Last time I used notes. Actually, a bit of a story. It has nothing to do with Frank R. Paul, but I'll try to amuse you with the story. Around 1983 or so, I was asked to be a guest at a cultural festival that was run by a few high-placed science fiction people. They were employees of the Dow Chemical Company. And they ran an annual cultural festival called the Midland Matrix in Midland, Michigan. And Frank Herbert had been invited to be the author guest, and I was asked to be the artist guest. And I was supposed to, on my arrival, within a few hours of my arrival, I was supposed to do a TV talk show with Judith Merrill, the well-known writer and anthologist and so forth. And our theme, our subject, was supposed to be the future of art. And the whole theme of the Midland Matrix was the future. So I was asked to prepare some notes about the future of art. And the fellow who spoke to me and invited me said, go ahead and book your air travel, and we'll reimburse you and so forth. But make sure that they fly you into the Tri-City Municipal Airport. So I called my travel agent and I said, look, I don't really know too much about Michigan, but I need specifically to go to the Tri-City Municipal Airport. She assured me, despite her youth and her inexperience, that she knew precisely where the Tri-City Municipal Airport was. And she could get me there in about a two-hour flight. It was a connect, but it would have been a piece of cake under normal circumstances. So I trusted her to go ahead and book my flight, and I received the tickets and boarded the plane, made my connect, schlepping several tens of pounds of artwork. Got out at what I thought was the Tri-City Municipal Airport, ran over to a cab and said, take me to such and such hotel. And the cab driver said to me, well, you better get back on that plane because you're not even in the right state. So I ran back to the desk and I said, I was supposed to go to the Tri-City Municipal Airport. And he said, well, this ain't it. This is the Twin City Municipal Airport or something. I don't know. Apparently there are several airports which have similar names. There's one in St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Paul, called the Twin City Airport. And there's another one in Texas. And I happened to catch the one that was in Memphis, Tennessee, or whatever, a similar name. Anyway, to make a long story short, with my connect and all, and from somewhere in Appalachia, I actually got reconnected, and it took me 7 flights. And all of the associated brain damage with, rising and changing pressure and so forth. I arrived in Midland, Michigan, many hours too late to do my show. And of course, since they were springing for the money to pay for my airfare and so forth, they said, well, you absolutely have to do this, and why don't you do it tomorrow night? The following night, there was supposed to be a panel on the future of science. I said, well, I don't know anything really. I'm not technically grounded. I know nothing about the future of science. And they said, don't worry about it. You're an articulate guy. You'll do very well. Just read your notes on the future of art. So I end up on this panel with this panel of truly cerebral types. I had absolutely no idea what the hell they were talking about. After about 20 minutes or so, the moderator realized I hadn't uttered a word, and he turned to me and he said, Mr. Di Fate, do you have anything to offer to the discussion? So I sat there and for 3 minutes read my notes about the future of art to an absolutely silent room. My fellow panelists attentively turned and looked at me while I spoke, and when I was done, they turned back and resumed their conversation as if I had never been there. So I have had a very checkered history with working from notes, but I'm going to attempt to try to recreate what I think Frank Garpol might have spoken about. The fact that we have someone who is actually present there, he can correct me where I'm wrong. I should probably give you a little bit of background on Frank Garpol. Are any of you at all familiar with Frank Garpol? Are all of you familiar with Frank Garpol? We're friends here. You can speak openly. Yeah. So some of you are, and some of you actually even knew the man. Frank Rudolf Paul was born in 1884 in Austria and immigrated to the United States as an adult. He had studied architecture and art in Austria and France, and had come to the United States. And as things happen, the building industry did not have an immediate use for his talents, and so he got himself a job working for a New Jersey newspaper called the Jersey Journal. It was fortuitous that in 1914, Hugo Gernsback discovered him working at the Jersey Journal and encouraged him to illustrate for his magazines, Hugo Gernsback being the publisher of the world's first all-science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, in 1926. But prior to venturing into the realm of science fiction as an independent freestanding entity, Hugo Gernsback published a number of science-oriented magazines that included works of science fiction. One of them was a publication called Electrical Experimenter. It later became Science and Invention, and some of you may remember Science and Invention magazine. At any rate, Frank Garpol was given the stories that were really based more, that had a kind of futuristic slant to them. And so he, using his skill as an architect and his abilities with forced perspective and so forth, he created these incredible vistas of futuristic cities and really made something of a name for himself. And worked for Electrical, or Science and Invention, or Electrical Experimenter. It changed its name somewhere in that period, until 1926, when Hugo Gernsback launched the first magazine exclusively devoted to science fiction. And Gernsback really became a legend in his own time to science fiction fans, so much so that in 1939, at the very first World Science Fiction Convention, they turned not to an author of science fiction, and there were many alive and working at the time whom you would consider giants. They didn't go to H.G. Wells, who was alive. They went to Frank Garpol. He was really one of the most beloved figures in the world of science fiction. Thus, an artist became the first guest of honor. I should talk a little bit about his style and tell you what was wrong with it and what was right with it. There was vastly more right with it than was wrong with it. Generally speaking, art historians kind of dismiss Frank Garpol because he wasn't, his art was not a fully integrated realization of all of the various aspects of picture making. He was great with linear detail. He was not particularly proficient at drawing people. But his stories often, his illustrations often didn't really require people. The focus was mainly on technology. He was an absolute genius at creating machines that were convincing to the eye. And he, with the editorial advice of Hugo Gernsback, formulated an approach to cover art that was really pretty smart given the limitations of reproduction at the time. You know, pulp paper is very absorbent. The covers were printed on a slicker stock than the interiors. The interiors were really raw pulp, and the ink would just be drawn into them. The covers were really reproduced in a process called letterpress. And letterpress didn't really create vivid reproductions of the art. The art tended to gray down as it was reproduced, and consequently, Frank R. Paul created his work in a way that he would paint brighter than he actually wanted the art to look, figuring it was going to gray down anyway, and it would just reach that appealing level. But it was like trying to hit a dartboard that's attached to the hubcap of a Cadillac that's zooming by at 60 miles an hour. It was always a crapshoot as to exactly what this stuff was going to look like. In some ways, he overestimated the degree at which the work would gray down and painted too garishly. And in other instances, he guessed the other way. But more often than not, his work kind of hit the mark, and fans came to appreciate what he was doing and understood and expected those bright colors. Well, it was really because of the influence of people like Frank R. Paul, and he had a few contemporaries who were working in the very bright palettes, that really elevated the level of brightness in pulp art. And many pulp artists started to paint brightly because of the need to compete with many, many other magazines on the newsstand. So pulp art, generally when we look at pulp illustration, we expect to see very bright, colorful works that are pretty simplistic, loaded with action and so forth. And Frank R. Paul was really wonderful at doing this. He also pretty much synthesized the school of thinking about science fiction picture making that has been enormously influential and of which I am a part. He was the first universally embraced gadget painter of the science fiction field. There were many others who had drawn the gadgets of science fiction. You have to remember that the industrial age was looking toward, in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, was looking toward the 20th century with a certain amount of optimism about all of the wonders that future technology would provide, how future technology would provide for the elevation in quality of life on Earth and in human civilization. And Frank R. Paul just was one of a great many people who fervently believed that science and technology would come to improve the lot for mankind. And that love just comes through in everything he did. So he was really largely responsible for creating much of the revered imagery of science fiction. He created the iconography, the revered elements of science fiction, the immense, city blocks long spaceships miles long spaceships that ply the lanes, the space lanes and so forth, and the rocket belts and the ray guns. Those were all things which were written about by science fiction writers, but of which he was among the first to visualize. So a lot of the hardware, a lot of the revered symbolism of science fiction really came from his body of work. At any rate, so he found himself at the age of 55 at the first World Science Fiction Convention in New York City, surrounded by 200 adoring fans, which back in 1939 must have seemed like a formidable crowd. Asked to address them about the theme of this talk, which is science fiction, the spirit of youth. I can only guess at what he might have said. Okay, I'm actually going to have to read my notes, folks. I've been winging it up to now, but... Okay. Oh, well, I finished that page. I guess we can wonder about what he spoke about. Try to recreate the world of 1939 for you. One of the reasons why they decided to have a Worldcon was because They were, and particularly in New York, was because they were having the World's Fair in 1939. There were 62 member nations who participated in that. And the theme of the 39 World's Fair was the world of tomorrow. So one imagines that he probably addressed many of the things that were represented there. Early television, for one thing. There was an obelisk of sorts, actually more of a skinny pyramid, and there was a sphere which represented the, became the icons of that particular exhibition. And he might have talked a little bit about architecture, of which he was fairly well versed, and the works of Frank Lloyd Wright, who was a contemporary of his, and how modernism in architecture was changing the way we looked at the functional world around us, that buildings were becoming austere and impersonal, and yet at the same time exquisite and elegant in a very simplistic way. He might have talked about the war, which was happening or about to happen in Europe. Poland was invaded in 1939. But I suspect, being an upbeat kind of guy, he probably didn't dwell on that too much. He most probably did talk about the science fiction stories that he read as a kid. To think that he was alive at a time when Jules Verne and H.G. Wells were alive and bright. Some of us were actually alive when H.G. Wells was still alive. He died in 1946, but Jules Verne died in 1905. To have actually been alive in the world, it would have been like being alive in the Renaissance when giants roamed the earth. These two great men who were accepted as mainstream literary figures. You know, remember, there wasn't this ghetto of science fiction for them to be relegated to. These guys were mainstream writers, important writers who wrote important books about important things. And of course, many science fiction scholars have talked about the great dichotomy of science fiction as exemplified by the works of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. So he might have talked about that. And of course, you know, Schiaparelli's revelations that there were canali on Mars may have been a thing. I mean, after all, you know, he had seen these channels, these grooves in the surface of Mars, and described them as canali, and that was misinterpreted as canals. And people like Percival Lowell were certain that they were seeing these damn canals. You know, Percival Lowell, responsible for building an astronomer responsible for building the Flagstaff Observatory, designed largely for the observation of the surface of Mars, did indeed chart maps of these surface bands, these canals, and was convinced that there was some form of life on Mars. So he might have talked about that and speculated about what life on Mars might be like, and how our first encounter with these beings might be just around the corner. And guys like Goddard were experimenting with rocketry in the Soviet Union. Of course, there was no Iron Curtain then, but in the Soviet Union, in Russia, there were a bunch of guys who were firing rockets in their backyards, hoping that eventually this might become either a weapon of war, although I don't think that was uppermost in their minds, or a very quick way of getting from here to there. And aviation was a relatively new science, a relatively new technological development, and I'm sure there was speculation about what the future of air travel might be. I'm sure that some science fiction writers were talking about planes that weren't driven by propellers. And then, of course, many of you, I'm sure, are very well aware of the fact that H.G. Wells in 1914 had described in considerable detail something that was later known as the atomic bomb. So there was a lot for these guys to talk about. And many of these things were prophetic, even though now we know that it's not necessarily a function of science fiction that it be prophetic. We learn more about the world we live in here and now through science fiction than we do about the world of tomorrow. I think the main thing that science fiction kind of does for us is it compels us to look at the problems of the world and at least come to grips with the fact that we need to deal with solutions to our problems. At any rate, So, we're done with page 2 of my notes. Card number 2 of my notes. This is kind of an interesting thing. Apart and beyond from what my speculations about what he talked about, and the fact that we eventually will be able to talk with some of the fans who were there and actually ascertain what he talked about, I thought about this theme, the spirit of youth, science fiction, the spirit of youth, and I thought a little bit about my own connection with the field and what it means and my own history. If I were Frank R. Paul, what I would have talked about, and since I'm not Frank R. Paul and I don't know what the hell he talked about, I'll tell you what I think about and what I thought about as a kid, and how the spirit of youth connects with the science fiction field. I think one of the interesting things about, I talked before about H.G. Wells, and H.G. Wells talked about the atomic bomb, but in his science fiction, that was a prophetic essay. In his science fiction, he'd been talking about things that actually happened long before they ever happened. If you've read War of the Worlds, for instance, you know that Wells talks about using poison gas, that the Martians use a black noxious gas to kill many human beings. And that novel was written in 1897, serialized in Pearson's magazine in 1897, published in book form in 1898. And Wells really predicted the use of poison gas as a weapon of war, and that really didn't become a reality until the First World War. So in that sense, he was really a couple of decades ahead of his time. He also talks about the mass evacuation of London, which really didn't happen until the blitz of the Second World War. So these were kind of, nifty things that ultimately did happen. Not necessarily nifty. I mean, they seem pretty dire to me, but nonetheless, he was able to speculate reasonably about what the future might hold. But of course, he made some mistakes. Remember that Wells still lived in a time when people were speculating about canals on Mars. And he invented his Martians with the understanding that they might be aquatic, that they might be sea creatures, or at least that's the implication given by his story. He talks about the Martians having tentacles and really shaped basically like octopuses. V-shaped mouths, quivering V-shaped mouths, tentacles, and so forth. And one of the really unique things about science fiction, unlike other forms of literature, is that you always get that occasional science fiction writer who will go over the same territory. And John Wyndham had written a novel, a British author who greatly admired H.G. Wells, had written a novel called Out of the Deeps. It's also known as When the Kraken Wakes. And actually, that was Wyndham's attempt to correct what he thought were errors in H.G. Wells' novel, and devised some very interesting things about what a possible invasion from outer space might be. One of the interesting things to consider in an invasion from outer space is the life expectancy of an alien creature. If a creature can actually live 1 million years, let's say, he can expend, say, 100,000 years in subjugating the human race by subtle means. I mean, he can genetically alter human beings by simply fooling around with the convection currents of the sun and pumping a lot of hard radiation into the atmosphere, and just wait for us to evolve into something less formidable than the human beings we are. But Wyndham speculates in the novel, not directly but through his narrative, that maybe if we were invaded, we might not even know we were invaded. And maybe when we finally did discover that we were invaded, we might never know the purpose of why we were invaded. And that's one of the nifty things about Wyndham's novel, is that these aliens, they don't come from Mars. We never know where they come from, which is probably the way it will be if we ever are invaded. They come to the Earth, they land in the sea, they rumble up on the land in these organic weapons called sea tanks. They use cylindrates, jellyfish, that become airborne. They're extruded through the shell of the sea tanks. They become airborne, and they expel these cilia, which wrap around the victims, these little tentacles that wrap around the victims, draw the victims inside their bulk, and use their digestive juices to dissolve the victims. And then these airborne bags of fleshy material roll back into the sea tanks, are extruded back through the shell, and the victim is never seen again. Are we out of time?
No, you got plenty of time. I'm out of time.
Okay. At any rate, it's a very novel idea, the whole idea of an organic weapon like that. But the long and short of it is, after 200 or 300 pages, Wyndham's aliens just simply pack up and leave, and the human beings are standing there scratching their heads, never quite knowing why the hell they came, what they came for, and if they took away what it was that they came for. So I think it's kind of nifty. And that's the unique thing about science fiction, is that you can actually have science fiction writers who go over the same ground and come up with totally different views. Good example, Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers. Guy with a military background who dearly loved his life in military service, and only because of his own disability was mustered out of the Navy. And then you have Joe Haldeman, who had a much more negative experience during the Vietnam War, who brought a totally different perspective in the Forever War stories, which are basically cover the same ground. So it's kind of a nifty thing about science fiction, a lot of that cross-pollinating and getting different takes on the same basic material. Anyway, so let me tell you a little bit about my view of the world and why I think about science fiction in the way that I do, and hopefully all of this will make sense, because at this moment I have no idea where I'm going. I was born in 1945, not long after the end of the Second World War, and as we've just pretty much talked about, that war was ended by the detonation of 2 nuclear devices, and for all intents and purposes, that marked the beginning of the atomic age. 2 years later, 1947, in fact in June of 1947, a businessman flying over Mount Rainier, Washington, saw what he described as saucers skipping above the peaks of Mount Rainier. And from that came the infamous headlines of flying saucers. And although people had been seeing strange lights and curious objects since the time of Ezekiel and before, that was the first modern UFO report, and of course it created a rash of UFO reports through the 1950s. And if you lived in the 1950s, as many of us did, you know that that was a pretty topical thing in its day. And a lot of the technology that came out of the war, such as the development or the improvements in computer technology and the use of synthetics and what have you, actually have had a significant effect on the modern world. Robotics, missiles, rockets. For me, the 1950s movie cycle, which made a lot of these dreams seem real to me, and reading science fiction in book form. It seems to me that people who grew up, who shared any part of this reality, older than me or younger than me or whatever, if you came in on any part of this at any time, born into this world, not really absolutely knowing why you were here and where you were going and what it was all about, would have some sort of curiosity about these things. I can't imagine people not being interested in this stuff. And there are a lot of people in the world who simply are interested. You know, you're born on planet Earth. It reminds me very much of the Phil Farmer stories, the Riverworld stories. You're reborn on the banks of some incredible river that goes on forever, not knowing that you died in some previous life, but here you are reborn and not knowing quite why you're there or what the hell you're doing, so you decide to float down the river and find out what's at the end of that river. Well, the analogy there for me is that here we are on this sphere, suspended in space, and we've learned how to leave that sphere in a very limited way, and we're eventually going to float down to find out what's at the end of that river. So, I think that's an exciting adventure, and we're really only at the very beginning of it. You know, paleontologists and anthropologists tell us that human beings have been, or the things which eventually became human beings, have been on the Earth for 2.5 million years. And we only have about 5,000 years of reliable recorded history to look back on. You know, we can talk about the pyramids, and we can, not with absolute certainty of how they were constructed and so forth. There are gaps, of course, but we know precious little. For the length of time we've been in the neighborhood, we know precious little about ourselves, about our own history. Yet in the last 5,000 years, we've become civilized. We've learned to develop machines that do our work for us. We've learned to fly, and that must have easily been. I would be willing to bet actual money on the concept that flight was probably the first science fiction idea. If we really evolved from Australopithecus, and these guys lived in trees, they must have looked up at those birds with some degree of envy. And that thought of flight, of soaring through the air, of repelling the force of gravity by sheer physical motion, must have seemed pretty appealing to them. Enough so that the legend of Etana, the oldest surviving legend of high flight, goes back 1,500 years, and the story of Icarus is still told in schools. So I would guess high flight must have been one of the earliest science fiction fantasies. It's amazing how far we've come. We've conquered the air, and we've scratched the edge of space. And I guess, like many of you, I regret that I'm not going to live the next 2 million years it's going to take for us to reach the end of the river. But I think that, we're born and we're in a rush to grow up because we want to assume the responsibilities, not so much the responsibilities, but the freedoms of adulthood. And after we've reached that point where we can legitimately be called adults, we spend the rest of our lives trying to recapture the youth that we ran so hurriedly through. For many of us, we look at science fiction, we see the past. We relive the moments that we read those stories for the first time, and we feel that sense of wonder, and we wonder if we'll ever feel it again. Will there ever be an author who can thrill us the way that whoever, fill in the blank, John W. Campbell or E.E. Doc Smith did? I guess that's the spirit of youth in science fiction, is that need to hang on to some sort of record of our speculations. It's recorded in the pictures that Frank R. Paul did and men before him. It's recorded in the stories created by Cyrano de Bergerac and all of those other fine gentlemen of the past to whom science fiction stories are attributed. Science fiction isn't a new idea. It's been with us for as long as human beings could think. And here we are. We are creatures who devised a method of communicating with one another, of recording our history, even though it only goes back 5,000 years. Gosh, there's 2.5 million years before that we don't know anything about. What did human beings do? I mean, they obviously didn't go to the local pub and drink beers with one another. I mean, they didn't go bowling, or maybe they did. Maybe they had some sort of prehistoric form of bowling, but no record of it remains. So here we are, at the very beginning of our intelligence, very beginning of our abilities to record our past, to learn from our past, to look ahead into our future. We don't really know where we came from. All we know is that we're here, and one of the things that we're supposed to do is duplicate ourselves so there'll be more of us at some future time to fulfill some future purpose. That's a fascinating idea to me, and it must be to you too. And I've been told we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to stop talking and let some of you talk. But Frank R. Paul and the Spirit of Youth, and I still have a page and a half of notes. I told you I stunk when it came to notes, but believe that as it may. Somewhere in there there's a noble purpose for all that I've said, and you'll just have to fill in your own ending. This is a write your own finale story. Do we have any questions or any comments? Anyone care to volunteer some reflections on the first Worldcon? Yeah.
I saw part of the exhibit downstairs of your work, and you had a whole, about 3 or 4 panels worth of what you considered your influences.
Yes.
Which probably struck your imagination in the way that Frank R. Paul's illustrations struck a generation, the generation group in the 39 convention on that. There were just a few notes out there. Would there be anything that you'd like to add about some of those influences or some of those artists with those paperback magazine covers that were part of your formative?
It's actually a very good question. I'm glad you went through the exhibit and actually read the text of my descriptors. There's a lot I could add. The fact is that the limitations of space prevented me from, and also availability of examples, made it virtually impossible for me to indicate all my influences. The influences come from very diverse sources too, because my key influences didn't come entirely from the static arts. I was as much influenced by the early motion pictures I saw. Rocket Ship XM, for instance. I had seen Rocket Ship XM. I may have said this already, so if I'm putting you to sleep or I'm being redundant, please forgive me. I had seen Rocket Ship XM at age 4. It must have been the first movie I'd ever seen. I was taken to a theater to see it. There was no video, and there was hardly any TV back then. 2 guys and a hand puppet was TV. And I saw the spaceship, and I was probably introduced to the concept of the spaceship before I even knew about airplanes. I mean, at 4, how much of the world could I have seen? So for me, that was real, and so that was a big influence. But Bonestell was, certainly the people who were there, Bonestell and Robert E. Schultz and Stanley Melsov particularly, these guys were enormously influential to me. I was questioned during an interview a couple hours ago. There was an interview with me, and I was asked, if these guys are so influential to your work, how come your work doesn't resemble theirs? I was actually asked that question in a more astute way. I'm just paraphrasing. And there really isn't an answer for that. What these guys did is they opened up the possibilities for me. They made me accept what could be done with the visual arts. And the observation was further made that I have very eclectic tastes in terms of what I will accept as good science fiction art. I almost indiscriminately love science fiction art. Being trained as an artist, I can tell what's wrong with it and what's right with it. But I'm influenced by everything. My kids influence me. Looking at objects from a strange perspective influenced me. I remember speaking to Mitchell Hooks. Mitchell Hooks is a brilliant American illustrator, vastly underappreciated, who was an important formative influence on American paperback art. And Mitchell had only done about 5 science fiction paperbacks in his whole life. Mostly he does romances and mysteries and so forth. And I asked Mitchell had done the cover for Chip Delaney's Triton, which shows a view of, it's this planetary landscape, and there's this large looming planet in the sky. And then there's this futuristic city sitting off to the right-hand side of the painting. And I asked him, well, how did you come up with the imagery for that? That for a guy who doesn't read science fiction, doesn't know anything about it, how did you come up with the imagery? And he said, well, I don't have very good eyesight, so I took my glasses off and I squinted down at my tabaret. And I looked at my magnifying glass, and I looked at my paintbrush rack, and I squinted down to the point that they were just shapes. And so I built the city. I painted that city based on this squinted down view of my own tabaret. And lo and behold, when I looked at it with that knowledge, I was able to see his magnifying glass and various different features of his tabaret. It was really fascinating. What an incredible point of view. I think that's what we do. We have a way. I can look at a glass sometimes, and just a reflection in it will give me an idea of how I can look at that differently from what it actually is. Anyway, I probably over-answered your question, but
that was fine.
Great.
There's one thing that I remember fondly about some of the pieces that you've done for Andrew Porter's magazines, and that when you write about films, especially, I like the way that you describe the visual style of William Cameron Menzies' Things to Come, which was it 37, 39?
35.
About that period of the 39 Worldcon.
Yeah, it was made in 35. Wasn't really. The release dates are actually confused. Its first exhibition was in 1935. But I've also seen 1936 listed as its release date. And of course, part of that too is that the story starts in 1936. Alexander Korda, the producer of the film, had convinced H.G. Wells to write the screenplay. So Wells actually wrote the screenplay. And in fact, it was Wells's idea to create those huge padded shoulders on the costumes, because he figured that these would substitute for pockets, so there would be no aberration in the line of the costumes that they wore. Menzies was a brilliant art director. For those of you who don't know the work of William Cameron Menzies, the first Academy Award ever given for art direction in a motion picture was given to William Cameron Menzies for 2 films that he worked on in the same year. He was brilliant. He was an illustrator who couldn't find work doing children's books, which was what he was trained for, and went to Astoria, Queens. He lived in Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut. Went to Astoria, Queens to find work and met Douglas Fairbanks. And Fairbanks hired him to do art direction on the original Thief of Baghdad. And then he ended up doing the remake, the 1940 Thief of Baghdad, for which he won 95 Academy Awards. Actually, he didn't win the Academy Awards. Vincent Corda, Alexander Corda's youngest brother, won those Academy Awards for set design and art direction in a color motion picture. But the actual art direction was done by William Cameron Menzies, who was a brilliant man in terms of his ability to visualize. He was the first motion picture art director to even think about using pictorial composition in the setup of the shots. You know, what they used to do is they used to focus on faces and follow people across the sets and so forth. He actually decided that they should design the sets and they should position the camera for a variety of different camera angles and compose the scenes so that the eye was directed and channeled by the elements within the frame, and also to cross-dissolve so that when one scene bled into another, the images were complementary. So Menzies was an enormously gifted human being. H.G. Wells despised Menzies. He thought he was an idiot. And every day that Menzies went to the set, Wells would have gotten there several hours before and left a note on his director's chair and would leave. And since it was Wells's picture, Wells had autonomy over Menzies. So he'd watch the day's rushes at the end of the day and sit down and write his notes and leave his notes for Menzies to see the following day, and Menzies would just throw them away. The film is very stodgy, but visually it's enormously impressive. You know, by that time in Wells's career, he was the elder statesman. He was really kind of an old fogey, and he was really pushing his political views. Things to Come is a tremendous ad for collectivism, you know, for Fabian socialism. It's a nifty film. The imagery in it is spectacular. I think, in a way, unsurpassed. For all of the state-of-the-art stuff that they do in science fiction movies these days, they haven't knocked this movie out of the box. Nor have they knocked Méliès's 1902 film, A Trip to the Moon. That movie is wonderful. It's 12 minutes of the most exciting motion picture you'll ever see. It's what movies are all about, what movie magic is all about.
This summer in Paris, I got to see a bit of some of the surviving material from Méliès's film they have at the Musée du Cinéma in Paris, which was a great thrill to see the moon sculpture that was.
Oh yeah, for those of you who don't know, I'll just quickly give you a rundown of who Méliès was and what he did, and I'm sure they're going to kick us out of this room. But Georges Méliès was a magician who bought the Claudine Theater in Paris. And when this newfangled technology of motion picture making came about, he figured, hey, this might be a great way. What you had was absolute control over time with a motion picture. You could stop the camera and you could move things and make things vanish instantly when you played it back. There is a story, probably this apocryphal story of him filming Lovers at a Coach and the coach moving on and then a hearse moving in its place and so forth. That's a crock. I'm sure that didn't happen. He was a bright guy. He was devoted to sleight of hand and positioning. He knew everything about how to make magic work. But anyway, the thing about Méliès was that he had really created, for all intents and purposes, the first science fiction film, 1902. It was based on 2 books, A Trip to the Moon by Jules Verne and The First Men on the Moon by H.G. Wells. It's a marvelous film. I won't bore you about the details of it. See it. It's 12 minutes. You'll never spend a better 12 minutes in your life watching it. But during the First World War, those films were shot on film stock that contains silver nitrate. And they used that for making gunpowder. So during the First World War, he donated his negatives to the French government so they could make bullets and explosives for the war. And for all intents and purposes, those were lost forever, except for a few collectors who managed to keep prints, which deteriorated because the nitrate stock is also explosive and it also is corrosive, so it just breaks down over a period of time. But A Trip to the Moon, this 1902 film, has been reconstructed. And originally it was hand-tinted. There are scenes in it that are hand-tinted, and it's just an absolutely marvelous film. Méliès is in it, on top of everything else. He's the star. He's the leader of the Earthmen who goes to the moon and meets with the Selenites. Great movie. Really imagine. Anyway, thank you for coming. We're out of time. Thank you very much.